Winter hiking in the Colorado Rockies, especially near old spots like Leadville, has always been my thing. There's a harsh, demanding beauty to it, a silence you don't find anywhere else. But that beauty can turn deadly in a heartbeat. This one solo trip I took, early spring up near the Never Summer Mountains, and that name's no lie. Winter hangs on tight up there. Things went from postcard perfect to a full-blown nightmare incredibly fast. The forecast had been clear, a solid window. But mountain weather, as you know, laughs at forecasts. One minute I was enjoying the weak sun on these vast snowfields. The next, the sky just boiled over, turning this bruised, angry purple. The temperature dropped like a stone, and the snow came down in a solid, blinding sheet. I seriously couldn't see 10 feet in front of me. I was miles out from the forestry service hut I was aiming for. No way I'd make it before dark, not in that kind of whiteout. Panic, cold and sharp as the wind itself, started to claw at me. I knew I had to find shelter and fast, or I'd end up as another sad story for the local search and rescue team. Through the swirling, disorienting snow, my goggles icing over with every ragged breath, I just about made out in the dark. Hunched shape against the screaming white, an old, dilapidated log cabin, probably an abandoned hunter's shack from way back when. It wasn't much, looked like it was about to fall down any second, but it was four walls and the promise of a roof. You hear stories in places like Grand Lake about these old, forgotten cabins, some with unlucky histories, tales of lone travelers or hunters vanishing without a trace in bad storms. Usually I just laugh that stuff off as local color. Right then, any roof, no matter how unlucky its reputation, looked like the Ritz-Carlton. The door was swollen shut with years of damp and half buried in a snowdrift that was growing visibly by the second. It took several desperate shoulder-numbing shoves before it finally groaned open with this horrible sound of tearing wood and protesting rusted hinges. Inside it was pitch dark, freezing cold, and it stank. A potent combination of old, cold wood smoke, damp earth, the unmistakable, cloying smell of decay, and something else. Something faintly metallic and deeply, primally unsettling that I couldn't quite place, but that made every single hair on the back of my neck stand on end. There was a crude, massive stone fireplace, black with what looked like decades of accumulated soot. A rickety, handmade wooden table with one leg, noticeably shorter than the others, propped up precariously with a couple of flat rocks. And two rough built-in wooden bunks covered in what looked like old, tattered, stiff animal hides, deer maybe or elk, and there were clear, undeniable, chilling signs that someone had been there very, very recently. A half-eaten can of cold beans was sitting on the dusty table. A rusty spoon still stuck upright in it, the contents not yet frozen completely solid despite the frigid, biting air inside the cabin. The ashes in the fireplace were still faintly warm to my touch when I cautiously, almost fearfully, reached in. Whoever had been in this place, they'd left in a howl of a hurry right before the storm hit its full. Screaming fury, or maybe is it hitting its peak, driven out by the same white devouring monster that had just driven me in. The blizzard raged outside for what felt like an absolute eternity. A screaming, howling white fury that shook the very timbers of the old cabin, making the loose, cracked window panes make a constant, unnerving, chattering sound. I managed, after a lot of fumbling effort with my nearly frozen fingers and some precious dry tinder I always carry in a waterproof bag, to get a small, smoky, reluctant fire going in the ancient hearth. It was more for morale, a tiny bit of flickering, dancing light against the oppressive, suffocating gloom, than for any real, penetrating warmth. As the long, terrifying night wore on, and the wind outside howled like a tormented spirit trying to claw its way in through the numerous chinks in the old logs. I started to hear things. Not just the storm, though that was terrifying enough in its raw, elemental, indifferent power, making the whole cabin feel like it was about to be torn apart and scattered across the mountainside. These were sounds from within the cabin itself. A soft, almost imperceptible, stealthy creaking from the small, trapdoor accessed loft space directly above me, as if someone very light or very, very careful was shifting their weight up there in the darkness. Then a faint, intermittent scratching, like long fingernails dragging slowly, deliberately, across dry old wood. From behind a heavy, crudely made, padlocked wooden door at the far end of the single room. A door that looked like it led to a small, windowless storage area or maybe an old root cellar dug into the hillside behind the cabin. My heart started to pound a heavy, suffocating rhythm against my ribs. Was I truly, completely alone in this isolated, storm-bound cabin? Or had the previous occupant not actually left, but just hidden themselves away, waiting for the storm, or perhaps for me to pass? Or, even worse, had someone else, also caught out in the blizzard's sudden fury, taken refuge here without me knowing, perhaps arriving before me and now concealed silently in the deep shadows, watching me with unseen eyes. The scratching sound came again, more insistent this time, more deliberate, from behind that locked door. Then a soft, distinct thud like something small and heavy, perhaps a tool or a piece of wood, had fallen or been carefully, purposefully set down onto a dirt floor. My mind raced, a frantic slideshow of horrible, unwelcome possibilities. An animal trapped in there, a porcupine or a marten, desperate to get out. Or something else. Something human and equally desperate, or perhaps far more dangerous, far more sinister. I am not a hero, never claimed to be. But the thought of being trapped in this tiny cabin with an unknown, unseen something. For days, that was far worse than facing the blizzard. I found an old rusty Kyre iron by the fireplace. Flashlight in hand, I approached the padlocked door. The padlock was old, flimsy. A few good whacks and the shackle sprang open with a sharp crack. The room beyond was small, dark. That metallic, unsettling smell was much stronger, mixed with what I now recognized as the unmistakable, cloying scent of old blood. My flashlight fell on old hunting traps, some disturbingly large, bear trap size, with cruel, jagged teeth. In the corner, a pile of stiff animal pelts. But underneath, a worn, muddy hiking boot, a man's relatively new, and dark reddish-brown stains on the dirt floor, splattered high on the logs. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a hunter's storage. This felt like a place of terrible violence. Then I heard the creak from the loft again, louder, more definite, directly above, followed by a soft, drawn-out sigh, unmistakably, chillingly human. I backed out of the storage room, mind screaming. Whoever was here wasn't a harmless hunter. Those traps, those stains, that boot. And now, someone in the loft just feet above, hidden. Had they been there all along, watching, listening? Or returned silently in the storm, waiting for me to discover their secrets? I didn't shout. I grabbed my pack, my emergency bivy, what little food I had. The storm outside was a killer. But whatever was in this cabin, whatever horrors it held, whatever waited patiently in that loft, felt like a different, more personal, more calculating killer. I eased the main door open. Wind and snow hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath. But I stepped out into the raging white, choosing nature's indifferent fury over the silent, unknown, potentially malevolent human menace lurking within those blood-stained log walls. I have no idea how I survived that night. I walked for hours, lost, disoriented, hypothermic, convinced I was going to die. Eventually, as the storm began to break with the first gray light of dawn, I stumbled onto a rarely used forestry road. A very surprised snowplow operator found me, half frozen, babbling incoherently. When I told the sheriff's department my story later, the cabin, the locked room, the boot, the bloodstains, the distinct feeling of a human presence in the loft, they were, as you might expect, skeptical. Lots of old abandoned cabins up there, son, a weary deputy said, his pen scratching slowly. Probably just squatters or some kids messing around. Got caught in a storm, same as you. And in a blizzard like that, your mind plays all sorts of tricks on you. You see and hear things that aren't really there. They said they tried to send a ranger up to check it out when the snow cleared enough for safe access. But I could tell from their tone, their tired, seen-it-all eyes, they weren't taking it very seriously, just humoring the traumatized, frostbitten hiker. No one ever contacted me about it again. I never found out for sure who or what was in that cabin, or what terrible things they were really doing up there. Were they poachers using those brutal, illegal traps? Were they fugitives from the law, hiding out from some serious offense committed elsewhere? What was the real grim story behind that single modern hiking boot and those dark, ugly stains on the floor? And who or what was in that loft, sighing in the darkness as I uncovered their secrets? Maybe it was just an animal trapped up there, a raccoon or a marten making strange noises. Or maybe, just maybe, I have stumbled into the middle of something far darker. A hidden human drama of extreme violence and desperation. A terrible secret kept well by the profound isolation of the high mountains and shielded by the convenient, cleansing fury of the storm. Those local stories about unlucky cabins and people vanishing without a trace in blizzards suddenly felt chillingly, horribly plausible. The thought of having shared that tiny, fragile shelter with an unknown, unseen, and potentially malevolent human presence. That's a cold that goes deeper than any blizzard. It's the kind of cold that stays with you, a permanent, unwelcome, shivering chill in your bones. My friend Chloe, she's a photographer, a really talented one, always looking for those unique, atmospheric, slightly eerie shots that tell a story. There's this disused abandoned railway tunnel near town in rural Vermont, a place called Hatcher's Cut Tunnel. That's become a bit of a local spot for adventurous hikers, urban explorers, and of course photographers like Chloe, even though it's technically on private railway land and officially off limits to the public. It's long, impressively straight for an old tunnel, and pitch black in the middle was amazing. Cathedral-like acoustics that make every sound echo. It's also got its share of local lore, as these places always do. Stories about it being haunted by the ghost of a rail worker who was supposedly killed during its construction back in the late 1800s or more. Recently, and perhaps more credibly, whispers among the townsfolk about it being a meeting spot for, well, let's just say less than savory characters after dark. People involved in things they wouldn't want the local sheriff to know about. Chloe, being Chloe, was naturally more intrigued by the haunted reputation and the photographic potential than deterred by any vague warnings about shady dealings. She decided she wanted to get some really dramatic, long exposure shots of the tunnel interior at night with just starlight, or maybe some carefully placed candles filtering in from either end. She managed to drag her very reluctant boyfriend, Mike, along for safety, and to help carry her gear, armed with powerful flashlights, extra batteries, and her heavy camera equipment. They went late, around 11 p.m. on a moonless autumn night, when the area would be completely deserted and the darkness absolute. The tunnel entrance loomed out of the blackness, a gaping, dark, almost hungry mouth in the wooded hillside. The air inside was immediately cold, damp, and smelled strongly of wet earth, decaying leaves, and creosote from the old, rotting railway ties that still lay embedded in the muddy floor. Their powerful flashlights cut sharp, dancing beams into the oppressive, suffocating blackness. It was undeniably creepy, a palpable sense of history and neglect hanging in the air. But also, Chloe told me, incredibly atmospheric and visually stunning. They were about halfway through in the deepest, darkest section where the slight curve of the tunnel blocked out all light from either entrance. And the silence was so profound it felt like a weight on their eardrums. Chloe was setting up her tripod, Mike holding the main flashlight steady for her. Suddenly that main flashlight, the powerful, expensive one Mike was holding, flickered erratically a couple of times and then died. Completely. Just like that. 1 second, a bright, reassuring beam illuminating the rough-hewn rock walls. The next, almost total, disorienting darkness, save for the much weaker, narrower beam of Chloe's smaller headlamp, which she quickly switched on. Damn it! What the hell? Mike cursed, his voice sounding tight and nervous in the sudden gloom. I just put brand new, heavy-duty batteries in this thing this afternoon. It can't be dead already. He fumbled with it, shaking it, banging it against his palm, but it was completely unresponsive. Dead as a doornail. Chloe's small headlamp cast long, dancing, insufficient shadows, making the tunnel walls seem to close in on them. The darkness beyond its feeble beam seeming somehow thicker, more menacing. It's okay, she said, trying to sound calmer than she felt, for Mike's sake as much as her own. We can use mine to get out. Let's just pack up and head back the way we came. Maybe another night for the photos. As they turned, a new sense of urgency in their movements. They both heard it. A soft sound from further down the tunnel, in the direction they had originally been heading, towards the other, more remote entrance. A whisper? A footstep on the loose gravel. It was hard to tell with the weird, distorting acoustics of the long, curved tunnel. Then another sound, closer this time, more distinct. A sharp, metallic click. Like someone cocking something. Or perhaps a small rock deliberately dislodged by a boot, a signal. Did you hear that? Mike whispered, his voice barely audible, grabbing Chloe's arm. Chloe nodded, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. They weren't alone in the tunnel. And whoever or whatever was with them knew they were there. They started walking quickly, back towards the entrance they'd come from. Chloe's small headlamp beam bobbing frantically, creating more confusion than illumination. Behind them, they heard more movement now, definite footsteps, more than one person. It sounded like their boots crunching on the gravel floor. Not rushing, not yet, but steady, deliberate, purposeful, as if whoever it was knew they had nowhere to go, knew they were trapped. Who's there? Mike called out, trying to sound authoritative, trying to project a confidence neither of them felt, but his voice cracked with fear. We know you're there. Show yourselves. Only silence answered for a moment. A heavy, pregnant silence. Then a low, almost inaudible chuckle. A deeply unpleasant, knowing sound seemed to echo from the tunnel walls all around them, as if the tunnel itself was laughing at their predicament. That was far worse, far more terrifying than any shout or direct threat. They were nearly at the entrance now, could see the faint, blessed, beautiful starlight ahead. A pale rectangle of hope in the oppressive blackness when they saw them, silhouetted against that pale opening. 2, maybe 3 figures. Standing there, completely still, effectively blocking the way out. They were just dark, indistinct shapes, impossible to make out any details, but they were definitely human, and they were definitely silently waiting for them. Chloe and Mike skidded to a halt, their blood running cold, a wave of pure, abject terror washing over them. Trapped. The figures at the entrance didn't move, didn't speak. And from behind them, down the dark, echoing tunnel, they could hear those other footsteps getting closer, more confident, less worried now. This wasn't a ghost story. This wasn't some old miner's restless spirit. This felt terrifyingly real, terrifyingly human. Were these the unsavory characters the local lore vaguely warned about? Had they stumbled into some kind of illicit meeting, a drug deal, a clandestine exchange of stolen goods? Something these people didn't want any witnesses to, especially witnesses with cameras. The dead flashlight, had it been a coincidence? Or had it been deliberately disabled somehow, a signal to others, or by some unseen technology? Thinking fast, her mind racing with adrenaline, Chloe remembered seeing a small, almost hidden fissure in the tunnel wall they'd passed on the way in. A narrow crack in the rock that looked like it might lead to an old ventilation shaft, or perhaps a small, forgotten side passage from the original mining days. "This way, quick," she hissed at Mike, grabbing his arm with a strength she didn't know she possessed, and pulled him hard towards the side of the tunnel, away from the main passage and their pursuers. They managed to squeeze into the narrow, damp fissure just as they heard the approaching footsteps from behind reach the spot where they'd been standing only moments before. They pressed themselves flat against the cold, slimy rock, barely daring to breathe. Chloe quickly switching off her headlamp, plunging them into absolute suffocating blackness. They could hear voices now, low and guttural, from the main tunnel, just feet away from their hiding place. They couldn't make out the words clearly, but the tone was menacing, angry. They heard the figures who had been blocking the entrance now walking into the tunnel, their heavy boots crunching loudly on the gravel floor, their powerful flashlight beams sweeping around, cutting through the darkness like searchlights. It felt like an eternity huddled there in the cold, damp, silent darkness, listening to those unseen people searching, calling out to each other in low, rough voices. Were they looking for them specifically? Or had Chloe and Mike just been in the wrong place at the very wrong time, accidental witnesses to something they were never meant to see? Eventually, after what felt like hours but was probably only 10 or 15 agonizing minutes, the voices and footsteps seemed to move further down the tunnel, away from them, perhaps towards the other entrance. Chloe and Mike waited, hearts still pounding, muscles aching from their cramped position, until they were absolutely sure it was safe, until the silence of the tunnel returned, now even more profound and terrifying than before. Then, very cautiously, very slowly, they slipped out of the fissure and, without a single word, ran as fast as they could out of the tunnel, out into the blessed, open, starlit night air. They didn't stop running until they reached their car, parked a good half-mile away down a deserted dirt road. When Chloe told me the story a few days later, she was still visibly shaken, her voice trembling. "We reported it to the local sheriff's office," she said. "Told them we thought there were people in the tunnel who might be up to no good, maybe involved in something illegal. They said they'd check it out, but you know how it is with those old abandoned tunnels. They're hard to patrol, and kids are always messing around in them." She never found out who those people were, or what they were doing. But the flashlight dying like that, Mike swore up and down it had brand new, top-of-the-line batteries. And those figures at the entrance, it felt like a deliberate trap, like they were hurting us. Her friends, when she told them, mostly focused on the ghost angle, given the tunnel's reputation and the unexplained flashlight failure. Ooh, spooky. Maybe it was the railway worker's ghost and want his picture taken? They didn't seem to register the very real, very human threat she and Mike had clearly felt: the pursuit, the blocked exit. Probably just other urban explorers or some local kids trying to scare you. And you all just freaked each other out in the dark, was the common dismissive refrain. But Chloe knows what she experienced. It wasn't a ghost. It was the cold, hard, calculating fear of a human threat, of stumbling into something dangerous. And illicit in a place where darkness and isolation were the enemy's greatest allies. It taught her that some picturesque or atmospheric spots have a very dark, very real underbelly, and that sometimes the most terrifying things you find in an old tunnel aren't the shadows or the echoes from the past, but the people who are using those shadows for their own hidden present-day purposes. And that a dead flashlight at the wrong time in the wrong place can be the start of a real-life horror story that no one else will ever quite believe or understand. I'm a pretty experienced backpacker, been doing it for years, all over the world. I love those long multi-day solo treks into really remote wilderness areas. The kind of places where you don't see another human soul for days, sometimes weeks on end. This one time, a few summers ago, I was hiking a lesser-known, challenging section of the Pacific Crest Trail, way up in the Cascade Mountains in Washington state, near the Canadian border. It's a stretch known for its rugged, breathtaking beauty. Alpine meadows, glacial rivers, dense old-growth forests, and its unpredictable, often severe mountain weather, even in the middle of summer. There are always tailies on those long trails, you know. The kind hikers share around a flickering campfire, half believed, half embellished. Stories about other hikers who vanished without a trace on certain remote sections, or about strange, isolated, almost feral communities hidden deep in the unnamed, unmapped valleys that don't take kindly to outsiders stumbling upon them. You mostly dismiss them as just campfire stories, a way to add a little thrill and a free song of fear to the otherwise peaceful hike. I was about 4 days into a planned 7-day solo hike, deep in the backcountry. The weather had been absolutely perfect up until then. Clear, bright blue skies, warm, sunny days, cool. Crisp nights perfect for sleeping under the stars. But then, on the 4th afternoon, a sudden, unforecasted, and incredibly violent deluge hit. Rain like I'd never seen before in the mountains, coming down in solid, gray, wind-driven sheets for nearly 24 hours straight, turning the usually clear mountain streams into raging, muddy torrents. The trail, which in many places clung precariously to steep, unstable hillsides covered in loose scree, became a muddy, treacherous, slippery river. I holed up in my small, one-man, four-season tent, listening to the storm rage outside, waiting it out, hoping my gear and my nerve would hold. When the rain finally blessedly stopped late the next day, I packed up my sodden camp and pushed on, only to find, about a mile further down the trail, that a massive, catastrophic landslide, clearly triggered by the relentless, saturating rain, had completely obliterated the trail ahead. A whole mountainside of thick, viscous mud, uprooted ancient trees, and massive, house-sized boulders had come crashing down, completely blocking the narrow, V-shaped valley I was in. And when I turned with a sinking, leaden heart to try and backtrack, to go back the way I'd come, I found that a smaller but equally impassable rock and mudslide had come, down behind me too, probably from the same oversaturated, unstable slope. I was trapped. Utterly, completely, terrifyingly trapped in this small, isolated, steep-sided, now waterlogged valley with a newly raging chocolate-brown river cutting violently through the middle of it. My satellite phone, of course, my expensive, supposedly reliable lifeline to the outside world, chose that exact moment to have absolutely no signal, despite my desperate repeated attempts. No service blinked mockingly on its little screen. I had emergency food supplies for maybe 2 more days, 3 if I rationed very, very carefully. Panic, cold and sharp, and tasting of bile started to set in. I found a slightly sheltered spot under a large, jutting overhang of rock near an old, collapsed trapper's lean-to that looked like it hadn't been used or seen by human eyes in at least a century. Its roof caved in, its logs rotten. I set up a small, miserable, damp camp, trying to stay calm, trying to think, to figure out my options. The only way out, it seemed, was to either wait, perhaps for days or even weeks, for the river to go down enough to even attempt a highly dangerous, potentially suicidal crossing, or to attempt an incredibly treacherous, near vertical climb up one of the steep, unstable, now waterlogged and slippery valley walls. Neither option was good. Both were terrifying. The first night I barely slept, despite my exhaustion. Every snap of a twig in the surrounding dark woods, every rustle of leaves in the damp wind, every distant rumble that might have been another, smaller slide, sounded like a direct, immediate threat. The next day, as I was cautiously, desperately scouting along the turbulent riverbank for a possible, less dangerous crossing point, or for any sign of another way out of this green prison, I noticed fresh signs that I wasn't, or at least hadn't recently been, entirely alone in this isolated little trap. A small, very recently extinguished fire pit, the stone still faintly warm to my touch, tucked away in a hidden, almost invisible grove of ancient cedar trees across the now slightly less turbulent river, a spot I hadn't noticed at all the day before. And near a couple of empty, modern-looking food cans, tuna beans, corned beef, not the kind of lightweight, dehydrated, specialized meals. A serious backpacker like myself would carry more like something from a bulk supply, from a discount store, or the provisions of a poorly equipped, perhaps desperate camper. And then, most disturbingly, I saw fresh boot prints and a patch of soft riverside mud. Definitely not mine. They were large, heavy, lug-soled prints, the kind made by serious work boots or hunting boots. And there was more than one set, at least 2, maybe 3 different sizes. My heart sank even further, if that was possible. Someone else was in this valley with me, or had been very recently, and they hadn't made their presence known to me. Why? Were they hiding? Were they watching? That night the sounds started. Not animal sounds, though the woods were full of those too. The hoot of an owl, the distant yelp of a coyote. These were human sounds, the faint, unmistakable sound of someone moving stealthily, carefully, through the dense, wet on the other side of the river, trying to be quiet, but the utter profound stillness of the valley night amplified every little furtive noise. A muffled cough, quickly suppressed. The soft, almost inaudible clink of metal on metal, perhaps a canteen cup against a belt buckle or a tool. They never showed themselves. They never called out. It was like they knew I was there, and they were watching me, assessing me, from the concealing darkness of the trees. Their intentions a complete, terrifying mystery. The local stories about this particular remote part of the Cascades, the ones you hear from old-timers in the trail towns, sometimes mention isolated, almost legendary groups of folks who had gone back to the land, in a very extreme, almost cult-like way decades ago after the 60s. Living completely off-grid, deeply suspicious, and sometimes openly hostile towards any outsiders or government men who stumbled into their hidden self-sufficient valleys. Or there were the darker, more modern tales of illegal logging operations or clandestine, heavily guarded marijuana grows hidden deep in the vast unpatrolled sections of the national forest run by dangerous, desperate people who would do anything, absolutely anything, to protect their secrets and their illicit, lucrative income. The offense, the source of my growing, consuming terror, was the terrifying uncertainty of it all. Were these people dangerous? Were they just as trapped by the landslides as I was, and equally scared, just keeping to themselves out of caution? Or were they the reason I was trapped? Had the landslide that blocked my way out, the one that seemed so perfectly placed, somehow been not entirely natural? That was a deeply paranoid, almost delusional thought, I knew. But in that isolated, desperate, nerve-wracking situation, with my food running low and no way out, my mind was going to some very dark, very unwelcome, very suspicious places. I spent the next 2 days in a state of constant, heightened, nerve-shredding tension. I'd see fleeting, ambiguous signs of their presence. A wisp of smoke from their hidden campfire in the mornings quickly extinguished. A fresh, muddy track by the river where someone had clearly filled a water container not long before. But they never revealed themselves. They never made any direct contact. It was a silent, deeply psychological game of cat and mouse, and I didn't know if I was the cat or, much more likely, the terrified cornered mouse. My meager emergency food supply was running out fast. I knew I had to try something soon, make a move, or I'd starve to death in this beautiful, terrifying green prison with unseen, unknown watchers as my only companions. On the third morning, after a particularly tense night of hearing more distinct movements, and even what sounded like very low, hushed, guttural voices from across the river, I woke up to find a small, crudely wrapped package just outside my makeshift rock overhang lean-to. It was wrapped in a large, fresh, green maple leaf, tied securely with a piece of plaited vine. Inside, there was a single, surprisingly large, freshly caught and expertly gutted trout, and a handful of wild berries I recognized from my survival training as edible and safe. No note, nothing else, just the food. Was it an offering of peace? A sign that they weren't hostile? That they knew I was in trouble and were trying to help in their own strange, silent way? Or was it a way of keeping me alive, placid? Perhaps even fattening me up until what? The ambiguity was almost more terrifying than outright hostility would have been. It felt like a message, a complex, loaded one, but one I couldn't decipher, couldn't understand. I ate the food, of course. I was too hungry, too desperate not to. It was delicious. That afternoon, strengthened by the unexpected meal, I decided I had to try and climb out of the valley. I picked what looked like the least dangerous, least sheer route up the northern valley wall. It would be a brutal, risky, near vertical climb. As I started to ascend, clinging precariously to rocks and roots, my heart in my throat, I glanced back across the river, towards the area where I thought their hidden camp was. And just for a second, a fleeting, almost dreamlike moment, I saw them. Two figures dressed in dark, practical, earth-toned clothing that blended with the forest, standing at the very edge of the trees, partially obscured by deep shadow, watching me. They didn't wave, they didn't shout. They just watched silently, motionlessly, like statues carved from the woods themselves. As soon as they saw that I'd spotted them, they melted back into the deep green of the forest, vanishing as if they'd never been there at all. The climb was hellish, taking hours, pushing me to my absolute physical and mental limits, but somehow I made it to the top, to the ridge, back onto a recognizable, if faint, trail. When I finally got to a ranger station, days later, exhausted, scratched, and half-starved but alive, I told my incredible story. The rangers listened, took copious notes, but they were clearly deeply skeptical about the unseen inhabitants and the mysterious. Life-saving food offering? Probably just some other experienced backcountry hikers who were also trapped by the slides and were trying to help you out in their own quiet way. Son, one of the older, weathered rangers said, not unkindly, but with a definite air of dismissal. Or maybe you were just really spooked by the isolation and your imagination, fueled by hunger, filled in some of the blanks after that bad storm. They did confirm, however, that the landslides were entirely natural, caused by the freak, unseasonable, and unprecedented deluge. No one really believed my full account of the Silent Watchers, the strange food offering, that profound, unnerving feeling of being observed, almost managed by a hidden, unknown, and possibly dangerous community. It was too vague, too lacking in concrete proof of anything overtly sinister or criminal. It was just my word, but I know what I experienced. I was trapped in that valley not just by the mud and rocks and fallen trees, but by the unnerving, almost palpable, intelligent presence of those unseen people. Were they just reclusive off-gridders, wary of strangers, but ultimately harmless, even capable of a strange, anonymous kindness? Or were they something more, something that required them to stay hidden from the outside world? Something that made them potentially dangerous if provoked or discovered? The food offering, was it truly an act of kindness? A gesture of shared humanity in a desperate, life-threatening situation? Or was it a calculated way to ensure I didn't become desperate enough to try and cross the river into their hidden, protected territory, to discover their secrets, whatever those secrets might be? I'll never know for sure. But it taught me that even in the deepest, most remote, supposedly untouched wilderness, you're rarely truly alone. And sometimes the most unsettling, most memorable. Most chilling encounters are the ones where nothing overtly bad actually happens, but you're left with the cold, unshakable certainty that you were, for a time, completely at the mercy of unseen, unknown people and their silent, inscrutable, and potentially life-altering intentions. It makes you wonder what other hidden communities exist out there, just beyond the edge of our maps, living by their own rules.